Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear the words happiness and education put together, what's your first thought? For many, the surprising response is often, but they don't really go together. It's almost like we see them as separate or, even at odds.
And that immediate puzzlement is actually quite telling, isn't it? It highlights a core tension in how we currently think about learning. Yet our source argues something truly fascinating. A good education should profoundly contribute to personal and collective happiness. And here's the kicker. Happiness should be a fundamental aim of education itself.
Wow. Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. To explore how happiness and education are, we look closely, deeply, and intimately related. We'll be drawing from a really insightful source that challenges us to rethink what learning truly means, focusing on whether our schools are helping you live a happier life, both right now and well down the road. You're going to discover some, I think, surprising insights from philosophy, history, even the natural world that might just change your entire perspective on what a well-rounded education truly entails. So, if we accept this premise, what does it mean for the very foundation of how we educate? Our source argues passionately that children, and honestly, all of us learn best when we're happy.
Right. It makes you wonder then, if happiness facilitates learning, why do we so often create environments that seem to, well, drain the joy from the experience? Now, the source isn't saying learning should be, devoid of struggle. Quite the opposite. Challenge and struggle are inevitable parts of the quest for knowledge and competence. Sure, but the critical point is, educators shouldn't have to invent struggles for students. Generally, happy students are far better equipped to navigate and find meaning in those naturally difficult periods.
That's a powerful distinction. Yeah. And speaking of happiness, it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all concept, is it? Our source takes us on this fascinating journey through different historical and philosophical views on what happiness actually means. It starts way back with Aristotle, who set up this hierarchy of human activity, elevating intellectual pursuits like mathematics or theology above practical work. The implicit idea was that some people were destined for manual labor so others could be free to think.
Which sounds pretty rigid today, doesn't it? And it's fascinating how John Dewey, much later, really challenged that. He called it a pernicious doctrine, a really harmful idea, basically, because it created this sharp separation between theory and practice, and it falsely labeled some subjects as, superior. Dewey's key insight was that the value of learning isn't in the subject itself, whether it's cooking or calculus, say, but in how intelligently and engaged you are with it. That's what matters. And he warned against going to either extreme, emphasizing only the practical or only the theoretical. Both can be problematic.
Right. And the echoes of that intellectual bias, that idea that some thinking is better than others,
Yeah.
it still shows up today, doesn't it? We still see math and physics often elevated above, say, natural history or even parenting, even though most of us use parenting skills far more often than algebra,
Yeah.
right? Our source even cites the famous mathematician G.H. Hardy, who apparently took pride in having never done anything useful, almost equating pure mathematics with something inherently better.
Yeah. And that idea that happiness is only found in a life of pure thought is what our source critiques as intellectual snobbery. While rationality is absolutely a treasured human attribute, sure, elevating it above all other human characteristics can unfortunately create unhappiness in those who don't feel they measure up. And it raises deep ethical questions, too, about the moral worth of beings who might not possess that specific quality.
Okay, so beyond philosophy, religious perspectives also weigh in. Our source touches on the idea of deferring happiness to an afterlife, and how some doctrines, particularly certain historical interpretations of Christianity, might even glorify suffering or use fear-based admonitions. But it's important to balance that, as the source does, by noting that for countless people, formal religions also bring profound joy and happiness to their lives.
Sure, and this brings up an interesting question. Why talk about suffering in a deep dive on happiness? Our source suggests a paradox here. Sharing the suffering of others or experiencing profound grief can actually contribute to a deeper sense of fulfillment. It's not pleasure in the moment, of course, not at all, but it's a longer-lasting sense that we would not be fully human without the griefs and emotional pains we share. It's about the breadth of human experience.
That reminds me of Abraham Maslow's peak experiences.
Yeah.
Those moments of transcendent ecstasy that can be triggered by seemingly everyday occurrences, a beautiful sunset, a moving piece of music, the sight of a baby, or the sound of the ocean, simple things. Our source also highlights what philosopher Martin Gardner called the sense of the numinous, that profound feeling of awe and wonder you get when confronted with mystery, something bigger than yourself. It's not necessarily religious, but a universal human appreciation for the unknown, felt by everyone from Einstein to Bertrand Russell. It makes you wonder, Can our schools actually encourage these moments of transcendence?
That's a great question, a really great question. And speaking of pleasure itself, John Stuart Mill, while he still elevated intellectual pleasures, he really broadened the scope to include feelings, imagination, and moral sentiments. David Hume went even further, insisting on the sheer importance of pleasure, noting that wise people can resist the temptation of present ease or pleasure for greater future happiness. Crucially, Hume argued that virtues are acquired because they are useful or pleasant, not because of some divine decree. He even included humor, recreation, enjoyment, and fun as valid parts of happiness, emphasizing pleasure that benefits both the self and the community.
So when we talk about happiness, it seems there are subjective, objective, and even societal influences at play. What's really compelling is the subjective dimension. Happiness is ultimately best judged by the person themselves. As outsiders, we cannot credibly say that someone is happy if that person says that she is not. Simple as that.
Precisely. But then there are also objective realities to happiness, recognized even way back by Aristotle. Things like health, a certain level of financial security, a good reputation, friends, freedom from worry and fear, and even sensual pleasures all play a role. It's simply unlikely that someone who is desperately poor or miserably ill would genuinely claim to be happy. And what's really striking, isn't it, is that surveys consistently show that once basic needs are met, more wealth doesn't necessarily equal more happiness. There's a disconnect.
That's a crucial point, yeah. It underlines society's fundamental responsibility to ensure a baseline objective happiness. Things like a living wage, medical insurance, safe housing, the basics. It would be truly callous, as the source put it, to expect someone struggling with poverty to just rise above it through sheer willpower. Yet, our schools sometimes make the opposite mistake, equating happiness entirely with future financial success. We need to encourage students to explore a much wider spectrum of what a happy life can look like beyond just economic opportunity. When we think about where real happiness lives in our lives, our source makes a really provocative argument that schools often completely miss the mark. For example, why do we dedicate so much time to algebra, yet teach almost nothing about something as fundamental as making a home?
That question really cuts to the core, doesn't it? Because as philosopher Gaston Bachelard eloquently put it, a home isn't just four walls and a roof. He called it our first universe, a place that shelters daydreaming, protects the dreamer, allows one to dream in peace. He suggests it's physically inscribed in us, forming organic habits. It's far more than just shelter.
It makes you think about how different people read a room. A detective, an artist, a child, a burglar, or even a vampire, as the source playfully suggests. Each sees multiple layers of meaning in what we call home.
And this highlights how a home provides identity, a safe place for possessions, privacy, and integrating function that goes beyond basic biological needs. We see this acutely in the struggles of homeless adults. The absence of a home profoundly impacts well-being.
And the concept of comfort, as we know it today,
Yeah.
it's actually a relatively new idea, right? Originating with the bourgeois home. Medieval dwellings, for all their ostentation, were often quite uncomfortable. Both physical and psychological comfort, as our source points out, are absolutely essential to domestic happiness.
Which brings up a really interesting thought. How could we rethink what we teach about housekeeping or maybe homemaking in schools? Historically, it was demanding women's work, sure, but technology has eased many chores. The proposal isn't a simple course, like Home Ec 101, but something called a spiral curriculum, meaning we revisit and deepen these concepts about home across different subjects as students progress. Imagine English classes reading children's literature about home, social studies examining housing history, art exploring the aesthetics of homemaking, science teaching child development, and even math looking at the correlation between socioeconomic status and school achievement.
Wow, and something so central to modern life: consumer education and sales resistance. In today's debt-ridden society, it's absolutely crucial, isn't it? The source highlights the importance of intelligent saving and consumption, challenging the common notion that consumption automatically equals happiness.
Definitely. This also touches on what you might call the bourgeois paradox. Figures like Hermann Hesse condemned bourgeois life as boring and hypocritical, Steppenwolf. Yet our source argues these critics often miss the joy and goodness hidden in the details of everyday life, things like tending a garden, watching children grow, or assisting neighbors. It reminds us that not all members of the bourgeoisie are alike. Each has an individual life and individual character.
But this whole discussion about home, it really touches on sensitive personal areas. How do schools navigate that without causing personal harm or reducing individual identity to just class or gender, as the source warns?
That's a critical point, yeah. The source stresses the importance of preserving each individual's unique experience. It reminds us that homes, ultimately, aren't just about efficiency or categorization. They should be shelters for the imagination, places where we can simply daydream or create beauty from the things we love. So the challenge becomes, how do we create spaces in schools that encourage that same kind of imaginative engagement, that joy of creation that we hope for in a home?
That's a great question. And on that note, here's another area where schools often miss the mark, according to the source: fostering a love of place. Education today is often designed to transcend place for a global economy, right? Our source gives this striking example: a biology class near the Atlantic Ocean that contained no visible living things or even pictures, completely ignoring its fascinating local pine barrens.
Right. And that disconnect is profound. Think about William Butler Yeats' sentiment that creative work must have a fatherland, or as our source prefers, a homeland. This really highlights how a love of place contributes to pleasure and pleasures of the mind. John Adams's unparalleled bliss roaming his hometown,
Hmm.
or Pearl Buck's mother creating an American garden in China. These are poignant examples of this deep connection.
So how can education foster this then? Our source proposes guidelines that respect incidental and differential learning. Different kids learn different things. Imagine reading poetry simply for delight, not just for analysis or tests, or sharing local folklore, or encouraging students to describe their favorite places. It's about restoring a sense of the sacred to teaching, meaning preserving and encouraging things that contribute to lifelong happiness.
hmm This connects beautifully to the biophilia hypothesis, the idea that humans might have a genetically based need to affiliate with nature. Even if many people don't consciously feel this, education can help foster it, starting with delight and moving towards responsibility.
But nature also has a darker side, doesn't it? William James vividly described the deadly horror and suffering inherent in nature,
Yeah.
like crocodiles clutching prey and the reality of animal pain. Our source suggests familiarizing older children with this, but not denying it even with younger ones, using the example of a rescued baby mouse to explore the paradoxes and conflict in our relations with nature.
hmm And that leads directly into educating for environmentalism. Wendell Berry, for instance, suggests that people who truly love the land think differently from policymakers. It's alarming to hear the anecdote of a potato farmer who won't eat his own commercially grown potatoes due to chemicals, choosing instead to grow a separate chemical-free patch for his family. That reveals a profound disconnect between what we produce and what we value.
And some very practical steps are suggested too, like transforming huge and useless lawns into gardens, thickets, and wildflower areas
Yeah.
to create wild places for children, especially in suburban landscapes. That really brings the idea home, so to speak.
Right. This also brings up complex ethical questions around our relationship with non-human animals,
Hmm.
including vegetarianism and factory farming. Our source asks tough questions. If humans became vegetarian, would farm animals go extinct? If factory farming abuses were abolished, would animals choose to live even if their ultimate fate is food? It highlights Isaiah Berlin's warning that it may not be possible to realize all of our treasured values at once. We're often trying to balance conflicting goods.
Okay, now, on to another essential yet often neglected domain: parenting. It's arguably the most demanding, rewarding, and universal human task, yet schools largely ignore it. How can parenting improve across generations if it's not actually taught?
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we're not teaching these foundational aspects of human experience, how can we expect improvements across generations? The source points to fascinating historical shifts, like the move from female midwives, whose name literally means with woman, to male physicians in childbirth. Surprisingly, this had devastating consequences, like puerperal fever spread by unsanitary doctor hands moving between patients. Terrible.
Yeah, wow. And it gets even more complicated when you consider religion's role sometimes. Some religious leaders even objected to anesthesia for childbirth, arguing its suffering was ordained by the Bible. This opens a critical discussion about the Adam and Eve story as a powerful myth that, unfortunately, has sometimes laid a foundation for the idea that suffering is earned or deserved.
hmm And it reminds us to move beyond the pregnancy is bliss versus pregnancy is hell dichotomy. While many women experience a wonderful sense of well-being, sure, our source acknowledges that considerable pain and discomfort are also common. It highlights the importance of addressing postpartum depression and understanding that challenging feelings are normal and not a sign of failure.
Sarah Reddick's categories of maternal interests, based on children's needs, preservation, growth, and acceptability, also offer great insight. It's about that ongoing tension parents face. How to protect children while also shaping their behavior without violating their freedom. That's a tough balance.
Thinking about this, instead of strict diets, can we discuss wise and pleasurable eating for everyone? Our source traces the evolution of feeding babies from, like, force feeding to demand feeding to Dr. Spock's more nuanced approach. It emphasizes the important role of fathers and how shared meals can be a real source of happiness for families.
And rather than just admonishing abstinence, our source proposes studying the long and fascinating history of human interest in alcohol and other mind-altering substances. Mead and hard cider, for instance, were common drinks for John Adams and even children in the past, which is kind of mind-blowing. This encourages critical thinking about why people seek escape through chemical means and how society should address underlying needs.
Exactly. And there's that ongoing parental dilemma of balancing protection and growth. When should Susie be allowed to climb trees? When is it safe for Jake to cross a street alone? This can actually be a great way to address teenagers' own issues by posing problems to them as future parents. Interesting approach. It also makes you ask, are children oversupervised and deprived of valuable experiences in some communities today? And are parents' ambitions sometimes inadvertently impeding their children's happiness?
Our source also highlights that much of what parents teach is informal, through games, stories, identifying insects, just life. There's almost a mystery to why this informal learning is so powerful. Perhaps it's because children are more attentive, have the freedom to select what they wish, and it's often accompanied by happiness. Schools, then, should consider how to provide settings where this kind of learning can occur.
That's a really thought-provoking point, yeah. And on the topic of parenting, our source suggests that an authoritative style, meaning guidance, shared activities, and talking with children, not at them, is most effective for liberal democracies, while still respecting cultural differences, of course. This approach cultivates the language and decision-making skills needed for such societies.
And speaking of cultural literacy, E.D. Hirsch's idea, while it's important, direct instruction alone isn't enough. Our source argues that immersion in shared exploration, rich in language and opportunities for decision-making, is crucial for truly acquiring it. You have to live it.
It's quite profound when our source explains that ourselves are constructed through encounters with other bodies, objects, selves, making moral life thoroughly relational. Virtues, therefore, are truly best learned within strong, happy relations. Makes sense.
That applies to honesty, doesn't it? Well, chronic lying leads to unhappiness, sure. Ruthless truth-saying can also destroy relationships. The source even gives the example of a church father who wouldn't lie to save souls, even if it meant their demise. Extreme. Both Hume and Aristotle noted that overzealous exercise can turn a virtue into a vice, precisely because it wrecks human relationships, which are so fundamental to our happiness.
Exactly. Courage, too, needs wisdom to separate bravery from foolhardiness. From a relational perspective, an act is virtuous if it tends to maintain caring relations with those immediately involved and does not destroy or greatly weaken relations in the larger web of care. An act is not virtuous no matter how courageous the agent if it deliberately or negligently harms others. That relational aspect is key.
This leads to the difficult but necessary conversation about war. While acknowledging heroism, students should critically question the virtue of war itself. Our source mentions how military training, like chanting "kill, kill, kill," can deaden or even destroy human moral resources, citing Jonathan Glover's work.
And interestingly, perseverance isn't always a virtue either, is it? Expending equal effort on everything can actually lead to mediocrity and unhappiness. The source suggests we should encourage students to find tasks at which they can work happily, aligning with their interests and talents, not just push through everything.
Okay, shifting slightly. Beyond traditional religion, our source explores the spiritual in everyday life, a sense of awe, wonder, and mystery. Think of observing a sunrise. Its suddenness, the shared experience with strangers on a boardwalk, and the soaring of the spirit it can evoke.
Right. But then there's William James's view on the wonder and terror of experience. He was quite blunt about it. He noted that human optimism is often leveled with the dust by the vanity of mortal things, sense of sin, or fear of the universe. Pretty heavy stuff. This is in contrast to the I-thou connection, described by philosopher Martin Buber, where true human connection, treating another person not as an object but as a unique individual, brings us goodness and a sense of shared humanity.
Anne Morrow Lindbergh recommended reasonable periods of solitude for everyone, especially women, noting that modern women often have less time for it despite technological advances, which is ironic. Creative tasks like baking bread or sewing, she argued, can really feed the center.
Lindbergh also offered a valuable insight on the fleeting nature of joy. Perfect moments are temporary and should be treasured for their evanescence. Clutching them actually destroys joy. Solitude allows for reflection, helping to integrate these memories into our overall sense of well-being.
This brings up Hannah Arendt's concern, though, that enchantment with small, everyday things could lead to disenchantment with public life and political inaction, a potential downside. Yet, the source notes the inspiring example of semi-isolated villagers sheltering Jews during the Nazi persecution at Le Chambon. They were turned inward, but acted outwardly. So the question remains, does turning inward lead to selfishness, or can it actually increase sensitivity to the larger world?
And that's a nuanced point. It's not either, maybe. Ultimately, cultivating intellect should involve encouraging students with genuine intellectual interests in any field, not just standard academic subjects. This means appreciating the pleasures of the mind that come from deep engagement with ideas. Our source clarifies that John Dewey wasn't anti-intellectual. He opposed the mere accumulation of facts, but encouraged sustained interest in ideas and thinking. The key is to offer abstract subjects to those who need or want them, rather than forcing them on everyone.
Right, so this really begs the question, how do our current educational aims stack up against this vision of happiness? Are we truly setting you up for flourishing lives, or are we maybe missing the mark? For instance, the common assumption that a nation's schools are directly tied to its economic success that comes under fire. Our source points to the A Nation at Risk report from the 80s and how the economy later prospered despite supposedly failing schools. Education, it argues, isn't necessarily the engine of the economy. Often it's the other way around.
And social mobility through education is also presented as a limited solution. While education can certainly help individuals financially, sure, it cannot solve poverty for all. It makes you ask that tough question. Why should anyone who works full-time at an honest job be doomed to economic failure? That's a societal problem, isn't it? Not just an educational one.
So if we agree on valuing all talents, how does the common push for equality of opportunity, which often means making everyone take academic math, like algebra and geometry squared with that? It seems like it could backfire, leading to fear and loathing of math for many students. And it could even damage other students who could benefit from more demanding courses by, well, lowering the curriculum to the lowest common denominator sometimes.
That's a really important observation, yeah. And the intense focus on getting all students through that specific academic curriculum can distract us from deeper social problems that schools alone cannot solve, such as poverty, which, as the source points out, society could eliminate with things like a living wage.
That makes you think about John Dewey's view of democratic education again. He saw democracy as a dynamic achievement based on communication and choice, requiring continual construction of curriculum through shared experience. This contrasts sharply with the idea that democracy depends simply on a common fund of knowledge that everyone must possess, like memorizing facts.
And on that point, guidance, not coercion, is absolutely key. Choices in a liberal democracy should be well-informed, requiring guidance from teachers who know their students well. That really underscores the importance of continuity in teacher-student relationships, perhaps even over multiple years, like looping. And honesty with students is essential. Look, if you want to do X in the future, you will need to study Y. Be straight with them.
This also brings us back to celebrating all talents. Our source emphasizes that people naturally differ in intellectual capacity and interests. That's just reality. The first task is to rid ourselves of the notion that intellectual capacity in the form of abstract mathematical linguistic talent is the capacity to be valued above all others. That's a strong statement. All morally acceptable human capacities should be valued and nurtured, allowing students to make informed choices about their occupational destinies.
It's fascinating, then, to hear the argument that all honest work should have dignity. A point made by figures like Karl Marx, Walt Whitman, Seamus Heaney. Vocational education, then, should not be seen as inferior. Absolutely not. Instead, it should be designed to be intellectually challenging in its own right, using the vocational program as a screen or lens for the choice of rich intellectual material. Make it rigorous and relevant.
And sometimes bright young women are even steered away from traditionally female but potentially deeply satisfying occupations like elementary school teaching, with comments like, "You're too good for that," which is just not, wow. This highlights a real disconnect between talent, happiness, and societal expectations, doesn't it?
It really does, and that idea extends to all students. Those whose interests are mainly intellectual should be encouraged in any field they choose, not just the standard academic subjects. They should derive happiness, even joy, from their engagement with a chosen topic. That's the goal. The point is to satisfy different interests, not force everyone into the exact same mold. So, wrapping this all up, How can schools genuinely foster happiness for you, the student, right here, right now, not just as some distant promise? Our source argues that happiness in the present is not only valued for itself, but it's also instrumental for future happiness. It builds on itself. Educators, therefore, must prioritize the quality of students' present experience. What's happening now matters.
Okay, that leads to the idea of happy classrooms,
Yep.
which involve a continually negotiated balance between inferred needs, what adults impose, and expressed needs, what children actually want. Teachers, our source says, should really listen respectfully to children's expressed needs. Seems obvious, but maybe it's not always done.
Right. And it really challenges the old view that pleasure in the classroom means little real work. Remember that. Our source emphasizes that play, like board games, contributes directly to learning, fostering reading, counting, negotiation skills, all sorts of things. It argues that worthwhile fun depends entirely on teachers' knowledge and artistry. It's not just chaos.
And this brings up a crucial question. What about common classroom practices, like cold calling on students, which can honestly cause genuine misery for some kids? I remember that feeling. The source suggests alternatives like pair work or small group problem solving at the board, where success does not seem diminished by sharing it, collaboration. The aim, ultimately, is to avoid associating learning with pain and fear.
That's such a powerful aim, yeah. And instead of empty praise, good job, for everything, teachers need real artistry to provide honest, supportive, and truly helpful feedback. Phrases like, not quite, let's explore that a bit, or you've got X wrong, but delivered with care and guidance.
And character development isn't just, theory or posters on the wall. It can be assisted by direct intervention, immediately stopping harmful acts, explaining why they're wrong, and showing better ways to interact, right there in the moment.
Intellectual growth, then, means using one's mind well in everyday life and a chosen field. Both matter. This requires broadening and deepening subject matter, making wise judgments about what is really worthwhile, and generally offering topics rather than coercing students into them. Choice is important.
What about addressing systemic issues, complex problems like dropouts or addiction? These obviously cannot be solved by some sweeping mode of reform. One size fits all won't work. The source suggests strategies like maybe separating the willing from the unwilling for certain subjects and emphasizing that continuity in teacher-student relationships over multiple years, that looping idea, but stresses that this must be by mutual consent. Can't force that either.
Right. This also brings up some concern about voucher plans, which sometimes treat education as a consumer good rather than a public good. It's a different framing. Our source argues that the public school system, at its best, acts as an advocate for the child, providing breadth of knowledge and critical skills to decide for themselves in their maturity, which might be lost in more narrowly focused private schools, particularly some fundamentalist ones.
This all circles back to the enduring why question, doesn't it? Without continual reflection on aims, education becomes merely what goes on in schools, measured almost exclusively by standard test scores. If content isn't truly necessary for adult happiness, then why is it in the curriculum at all? It's a fundamental question.
That's the central challenge, exactly. Take poetry as a pedagogical model. If the true aim of teaching poetry is delight and wisdom, then the pedagogical methods should align with that. How you teach should match why you teach. This means looking for signs of joy, deep thought, eagerness to read more. Not just memorization or analysis of technical elements like iambic pentameter. It's about being moved by a non-believer's spiritual longing in a poem, or maybe choosing against war after reading war poets. Deeper impacts.
And this reflection extends to rethinking all classroom routines, everything. The source encourages us to reflect on everything from seating charts and hand-raising to homework from the perspective of our stated aims. Rules should facilitate human interactions and be explained, not be inviolable ends in themselves, thus helping students understand socialization itself.
And parental involvement in homework is another area to reconsider. Our source critiques coercive homework practices, like requiring parents to sign papers every night, noting they can add to the tensions of home life instead of bringing parents and children together. It can become another battleground. The aim should be to increase the happiness latent in parent-child relations, not add stress.
Overall, while we can acknowledge historical progress in making schools more humane since the early 20th century, things like less corporal punishment, addressing segregation, encouraging women in math and science, feeding hungry children, there have been real gains. But there's a vital caution here. The academic purpose, when relentlessly pursued above all else, once drove many children out of schools entirely. The goal, our source reminds us, should be to guide students toward the intelligent use of their intellectual capacities in both personal and public life, enabling them to evaluate and direct change, to resist harmful changes, and promote those that contribute to human flourishing. A broader vision. So what does this all mean for you, the learner, listening right now? We've taken a deep dive into the profound idea that happiness isn't just some nice byproduct of education, but should truly be its guiding star. It's about a constant dance between what we need, what we want, and what truly makes for a rich, fulfilling life, starting now.
Yeah. It's clear that genuine education involves nurturing your whole self, your personal capacities, your relationships, your connection to place, your sense of wonder. It's about cultivating wisdom and joy, not just accumulating facts for some distant future reward that might not even come in the way you expect.
This deep dive leaves us with a provocative thought, maybe a challenge. If we truly believe that happiness should be an aim of education, what deeply ingrained, perhaps even comforting practices in our schools today would we need to courageously let go of, to truly allow you to find joy in learning and flourish?